All right, everyone. That was such great music. Welcome and thank you for joining us for the 2021 webinar, Surviving a Pandemic from Emergency Response to Best Practice. I'm Sherilyn Seeley, the Program Manager for Grantmakers in the Arts. Before we begin, please take a moment to review the Zoom webinar features so you have an optimal experience with us today. First and foremost, you can feel free to introduce yourself in the chat by clicking the chat symbol in the toolbar at the bottom of your screen. Be sure you're sending your message to all panelists and attendees. Also, we expect that you'll have some questions for our panelists throughout the presentation, so please use the Q&A feature for the panelist questions to be sure that we see them at the end. And lastly, if you would like your experience to include live captioning, select closed captions or CC feature in the toolbar at the bottom of your screen and select show subtitles. So before the coronavirus pandemic, arts and culture funding statistics showed that only 4% of foundation funding went to organizations of color and only 2% of all cultural institutions received almost 60% of all cultural funding. Not only did the pandemic make matters worse for everyone, but already struggling organizations faced the threat of discontinuing programs, and some organizations closed their doors for good. Over a year after the pandemic took a harsh toll on our communities, we've seen funders exercise trust and solidarity in their emergency responses by making monumental shifts in their practices. So today we're joined by Eddie Torres, President and CEO of Grantmakers in the Arts, Dr. Mary T. Basset, FXB Professor of the Practice of Health and Human Rights at Harvard School of Public Health, Gary Steuer, President and CEO of Bonfils-Stanton Foundation, and Tempestt Hazel, Art Program Officer at the Field Foundation. They'll speak about the ways that they are reimagining funding for their grantees 1 year after the pandemic and beyond. Eddie Torres joined Grantmakers in the Arts as President and CEO in 2017. Torres served on the GIA Board of Directors from 2011 through 2016, and he most recently served as Deputy Commissioner of Cultural Affairs for New York City. Dr. Mary T. Basset has dedicated her career to advancing health equity. She's currently the director of the FXB Center for Health and Human Rights at Harvard University and the FXB Professor of the Practice of Health and Human Rights at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. Prior to joining the FXB Center, she served as New York City's Commissioner of Health from 2014 to 2018. Tempestt Hazel is a curator, writer, and founder of 60 Inches from Center, a Chicago-based arts publication and archiving initiative that promotes and preserves the practices of BIPOC and LGBTQIA+ artists and artists with disabilities across the Midwest. She's also the arts program officer for the Field Foundation, where she works with organizations, collectives, and artists to support culture, creative practices, and creative startups inside chronically divested communities of Chicago. And Gary Steuer joined the Bonfils-Stanton Foundation as president and CEO in 2013. Since that time, he has focused on leveraging the voice and legacy of the foundation to sustain and strengthen the arts and nonprofit leadership in the community. He empowers the foundation's signature programs and initiatives to ensure they are advancing innovation, equity, community, and quality of life. At the very end of the presentation, I'll be joining to facilitate a Q&A, so be sure you use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen to submit your questions. And with that, I will kick it over to our guests. I'll ask GIA President and CEO Eddie Torres to get us started.
Great. Thank you so much, Sherilyn. And I just wanted to say I'm really honored to be able to participate in this webinar in such company. So thank you to all of you for being here. Here we go. So I'm just going to establish some broad context. Late last year, late 2020, Grantmakers in the Arts conducted a survey of recent and upcoming changes in arts grant-making practice. We had a response rate of about 50% of our members, and we're going to release another survey in mid-August so that this coming autumn, we can reflect on these findings, find out what has held true, what has continued to advance, etc. So please be on the lookout for that. What we found was that in 2020, ARC's grant makers increased their flexibility and will continue to do so. So in terms of greater flexibility in the use of funds, 80% allowed greater flexibility and about 50% will make that standard. Multi-year grants, about 16% have increased multi-year grants and about a quarter will now make multi-year grants standard. General operating support, over half made their grants into general operating support and over a third will make general operating support standard. And supporting organizations that they haven't in the past, about half have done so and about half will continue to do so. They've also increased support to individual artists and cultural workers and will continue that increase. So first of all, those that have already been supporting artists and cultural workers increased their support. 41% increased their support, with about a third making those increases standard. For those that haven't been supporters of individual artists and cultural workers, a little more than a quarter have expanded their grant making to include support for individual artists and cultural workers, and about 20% will make that standard in the future. And arts grant makers are increasing their support to BIPOC artists and organizations. Now, about 41% of GIA survey respondents reported that they're increasing their giving in all, was doing so in support of anti-racism. Over half reported changing their practices by giving to more BIPOC-led organizations, and 65% will increase their giving to BIPOC organizations and artists as standard going forward. Now, to put that into context, a number of studies were conducted last year looking at the field of philanthropy in general, and you had general response rates of about 12 to 18% identifying their increased giving in support of anti-racism, and a tiny sliver of those projecting doing so in the future. We are really, really heartened by grant makers in the arts, by our members stepping up the way that they have. And so again, to reiterate, this is a study that we did of last year's practice. What's going to come out is a survey of this year's practice. You should be getting that in a couple of weeks. We're looking forward to engaging you on that. So thank you. Mary.
And I'm really delighted to be able to join today. And I had the pleasure of working with you, Eddie, when we were both in city government and even got our agencies to work collaboratively. But I accepted this invitation because I really believe that the arts are important to public health. And in the midst of a pandemic, we're seeing examples of that. And that's what I'm going to talk about today. If I can, I hope I'll be able to advance my slide. There we go. So first, I'm going to describe how COVID-19 has really pulled the curtain back on the US racial hierarchy, and together with the murder of George Floyd in May of 2020, really made clear that these are structural in origin and not simply the result of individuals who have bad ideas. And the arts really came to the fore in helping us to see this. One of the things that I like to say is that people invested in arts when we didn't have, as a species, the ability to guarantee our food survival. We painted on the sides of caves, we made music. So the arts have a real role to play as we as a nation begin to tackle structural racism. Now, the numbers tell a story of a hugely increased risk of getting infected, of getting sick, and of dying of COVID-19 if you are Black, Latinx, or Indigenous compared to people who are classified as white. These rates are not minorly different. They're 2 to 3-fold higher and much, much higher for young people. The rates range from 5 to 9-fold higher among young adults who are Black or Latinx as compared to whites. So not only are people of color dying at higher rates, they're dying at younger ages. And as we all know, the vaccinations continue to lag and are not proportionate to the presence of COVID and the impact of COVID on these communities. Now, racism is a complex phenomenon. When I was a health commissioner, I learned not to use that word, complex. Nothing's ever supposed to be complicated, but this is a complex phenomenon rooted in our history. Most of us experience racism as something that occurs among individuals, but structural racism refers to the way it's embedded in our history, reproduced in our culture and our institutions. So that it's not simply the collection of individual prejudices. And it is important to keep in mind that it's not a genetic category. Race doesn't refer to ways in which people differ biologically. The way in which racism works is through our economy, through our access to the resources for a healthy life, which include not only access to healthcare, but housing, living wage, which include our ability to gain representation in government and include the safety of our environments, both inside our homes and in our communities. And we in health often use images to show how geography affects the health of our populations. This is a map, I think this was at the beginning of the pandemic, and these were test positives. And all of you who know New York will see that this very dense part of our city had the lowest positivity rate, and communities that we're all familiar with had higher positivity rates. Here we are in central Brooklyn, Queens, and these communities continue to have higher rates. This is in July. This I just want to highlight to underscore the not racism, not race. These are blue collar, largely white areas of Staten Island. Police officers, firefighters, people who kept going to work through the pandemic, and they had higher risk too. So the risk was related mainly to exposure and who was keeping working, who was living in crowded housing. And it resulted in this much higher risk. We're now seeing an uptick. And I feel like since I have the chance to talk to people, I have to tell people that the case counts are going up again in New York City. Hospitalizations are still decreasing. And again, we see the wealthiest part of our city continues to be, I still think of New York as my city, although I'm talking to you from Boston, continues to be less affected, even though it's the densest part of our city. So racism refers to a system of power. It's not, and it's rooted in our history, and it reflects our laws, our health, and everything. And it is also reflected in our arts. This is something by an artist of a child. It's titled Slum Lad. It displays an environment in which the walls are being torn down, maybe a sign of hope. And here's a classic Norman Rockwell displaying these young people after a prom, golden light, a completely different type of image, greatly reflecting the impact of race on our images of communities. And I also want to talk about the importance that arts has placed on to social movements, that it's part of the resilience and the fact that people have assets and not only burdens. It's been a way of communicating and promoting cohesion and solidarity among communities and giving people a space in which to express their feelings and beliefs in a way that comes across that statistics like the ones that I've given you will never do in the same kind of way. And we saw this most powerfully in my recent memory in the representations of police-involved killings. The United States leads wealthy countries in the numbers of people who die as a result of encounters with police. These are overwhelmingly young Black men. They have the highest risk of dying as a result of a police encounter, and are the least likely to be armed. And young men between 15 and 34, young Black men, police-involved killings are in the top 10 causes of death. There's George Floyd. Here are more images of George Floyd, showing sort of his iconic status within communities, as well as others who have lost their lives. This is a way in which the data can be complemented by an image. This is showing that when a white officer answers a 911 call, there's more likely to be a death. This is how an artist portrayed it. And here we have the faces behind the numbers that we in public health often describe, faces that were used all over the world in the protests that emerged after the May killing of George Floyd. I believe this is Paris. Yes, it's Paris. And so we all had the visual arts, but also we had music. Somebody amongst us knew that that was Branford Marcellus welcoming you into the room. The music also became a way of conveying concern and also rejection of the climate of violence that has allowed police to result in so many deaths. So as final remarks, the arts really do tell a story in a way that public health can't ever tell it, that it's an important, not just a decoration of the story, but an important complement to the story, which continues to unfold in our communities. And many of these efforts were led by artists of color. So with that, let me thank you and hope that we're more or less still on time.
All right.
Over to you, Tempestt.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Basset. Good morning, everybody. And it's so wonderful to be here. So to keep us on time and so that we can have a great discussion, I'll just dive right in. So I'm Tempestt Hazel. I'm the Arts Program Officer at Field. And I'm also, as was mentioned, a writer, a curator, and the co-founder of an organization called 60 Inches from Center. And the reason why I think it's important to mention all of these things is because it's deeply informed my approach to developing the arts program and portfolio at Field over the past 4 years. So I also want to start by showing a little bit of Chicago-ness. So throughout this presentation, I'll be sharing images of some of the organizations doing work in Chicago that beautifully illustrates and has shaped Field's grant-making model, each of which has been supported by Field in various ways through and beyond grant-making. So here's a little bit of quintessential Chicago culture for you. Chicago footwork, for those of you who know, by the Era Footwork crew. So I bring this image up and talk about Chicago style because if I were to describe Field's grant-making model, I would say that like footwork, it's very Chicago in that it's deeply informed by the distinct geographic and demographic characteristics of Chicago, the artists, the cultural workers, the community organizers who call Chicago home, also the 77 neighborhoods that have their own distinct qualities, and then the historic, and as Dr. Basset mentioned, the historic, systemic, and structural inequities and racism that have come to define the needs of Chicago residents, Chicago families, and communities, whether that's creative or otherwise. So to kind of talk about how Field moved through the pandemic and where it's at now, I have to start with a bit of context. So after over a year of research and anti-racism training with the board and the staff and the development of Field's heat maps, Field's grant-making model shifted substantially in 2017 in a way that intentionally forefronted the geographic and racial inequities of Chicago and address them through our program areas, which is justice, art, media and storytelling, and leadership investment. Field also intentionally focused on tackling disinvestment by turning the foundation's attention directly to directly investing in the majority of our annual giving across all of our program areas to the communities and the people who are from and doing work within these communities. So putting these concepts and intentions down in writing and speaking it publicly was a huge step in the process of shifting the model for Fields, but it is, in my opinion, only a first step and arguably one of the easier steps in this kind of process. So the harder part is actually putting it into practice. So our next step was to put Fields' refreshed guidelines out in the world through direct outreach and listening. So we held info sessions and listening sessions within the communities we sought to connect with, and we scheduled hundreds and hundreds of calls with organizations and individuals all over the city. And each of those sessions, those conversations or new batches of applications or LOIs really helped us to understand how the people we wanted to reach were interpreting our words. And their responses helped us to refine our grant making and what we were saying we wanted to do. So within the arts portfolio, what started off as a really wide scope has continued to narrow out of necessity and a deeper understanding of several factors, such as Field size as a foundation, the frequency and size of our grants, and an understanding of how those kinds of factors directly influence what kind of impact our grant support can have. And all of those things combined with hearing what needs, practices, and values were at the heart of the community-based cultural work that was happening. Also exploding conventional definitions of art, understanding how artists operate, not just organizations, and understanding how systemic and historic racism and racial inequities have a permanent imprint on the way that nonprofit structure does or does not work within systemically neglected communities and contexts, which I think is a really important point. So prior to the COVID-19 pandemic, Field's art portfolio looked differently than your typical art portfolio because it was doing things like exploding those conventional definitions of art by understanding and including land stewardship or activism and community organizing, or solidarity economies as creative and cultural practices, or understanding that when we talk about disinvestment, it's a matter of dollar and cents. So rethinking and in some cases rejecting nonprofit as a primary method and model is necessary. Then also making a direct connection to the arts by understanding that artists, the people without which we have no arts, are themselves businesses and community organizers and so many other things. So as the pandemic happened, Fields had already been hearing stories directly from our communities about other pandemics that were generations in the making, and as well as the solutions that we're dreaming up and manifesting. So we worked to ensure that our grant making model reflected that. But that said, one of the biggest changes that took place during the pandemic was the evolution of Fields heat maps through the Mapping COVID-19 Recovery Initiative. So this initiative really took in a lot of data. It was a big collaborative effort that was really meant to visualize some of the factors that were deeply impacting and being exacerbated during the pandemic within Chicago. So these maps were created as a way to really look at history through this data and as a way of making sure that we don't repeat the same mistakes. So the research map, so I put the URL at the bottom. There's a lot of information on the site. So I really recommend you kind of dive in because I'm gonna skim through it really quick. But it'll break down kind of the study area that was created for these maps and some of the information that was collected. So I'm going to, for the sake of this group, kind of pull out some of the maps that might be most relevant and most interesting. So I'll kind of click through these so you could see some of them. So some of the things like school closings in Chicago, redlining, those are the types of things that were considered. Also things like the communities that folks who were serving in prison, where they came from, and then also folks with disabilities, There were a lot of, there's data around essential workers and those without health insurance and healthcare. There's also data around where health centers and pharmacies are located within Chicago, and kind of shows you how that information is mapped out too. And then also funding, where funding has landed during the pandemic, prior to the pandemic, in various ways, whether philanthropy or through city agencies and things like that. So I'll wrap up with a quick overview and reiteration of some of the things that Fields has necessarily dug more deeply into and will continue to advocate for, all of which are things that we are exploring in many ways prior to the pandemic, but have reached a new level of relevance during the pandemic. So first, I'll start with artists and cultural workers are serving much more than arts within their communities, and that's not just about strategy. Yes, the meeting of everyday material needs of people and families is often a barrier to having the mental and physical capacity, as well as the time to commit to art, but it goes beyond that. Many community-based organizations hold community care and mutual aid as a central core value within their work, not just something to get participants through physical and digital doors. So here you see Gage Park Latinx Council and Art Space Chicago's artist-run free stores and street-level markets that provide food and other materials to their neighbors, no strings attached. Second, artists are fierce warriors for justice, not just the ones making the message irresistible. They are drafting legislation, they're driving policy change, they're testing out new solutions, they're acting as community organizers and pushing for systemic change. So here you see the previous slide with the Chicago Torture Justice Memorial, which is an incredible historic effort for reparations for survivors of police torture. And then here you see an artist's interpretation of different ways to reimagine police trucks as tools for community solutions around safety. The third, I will say, is community reinvestment must expand beyond the nonprofit. The pandemic has taught us that some of the containers and entity types that dominate the cultural and service sectors are not working. They're extractive and rely on access to wealth that many communities don't have. So we in philanthropy need to think differently if we want to tackle that disinvestment. And then here you see Blue Tin Production, which is an entirely immigrant and refugee-run, member-owned fashion production cooperative that is doing amazing things. And then the last thing I'll say is listening, continuing to listen. Things change every day, as we're seeing now. So our guidelines as funders and our approaches can't remain stagnant. They must be constantly questioned and tested and refined, and done so in collaboration with the people, the artists, and the communities we seek to serve. And with that, thank you. And I will pass it to Gary.
Okay. For a minute, my unmute disappeared. I think when the controls were passed to me, so it took me a minute to unmute. Thanks, Tempestt, and I'm such an admirer of the work of Field. So that was very inspiring, and also thank you, Dr. Basset and Eddie as well. So I'm going to go over just a bit of context on Bonfils-Stanton Foundation or COVID responses, and then some thoughts on next steps for us and perhaps in keeping with this session, the sector as a whole. So first, the foundation, we were established in 1962. Our grant making started in 1981. Current assets, thanks to the crazy inexplicable run up in the stock market, to be frank, are now, we just broke 100 million. We've generally been in the kind of 70 to $80 million range. We have historically granted about $3 million a year. Important point to note is that our grant making, we had historically funded everything. And before my arrival at the foundation, the trustees went through a process of looking at being more strategic and identified arts and culture as one area where we could make a profound difference. We actually, Denver had no foundation focused on arts and culture funding. So they felt that of all the things that we could focus on, that's where we could really make the biggest difference. So since 2013, that's been our focus in grant making, combined with a sort of programmatic focus on leadership, which I'll talk about a little bit. We run a Livingston Fellowship Program. We are a place-based funder, so like Field, we are focused on the Denver community. I will say we've had to re-examine that a bit, because with the gentrification and displacement that's happened in Denver, we have a kind of suburbanization of poverty issue where, you know, communities of color, as we focused on being more equitable in our grant making, increasingly that work and those populations are outside Denver because they can't afford to be in Denver anymore. So we're actually reassessing that geographic focus, and we've been engaged in major efforts over the last several years, and kind of like Field, I think, accelerated by the pandemic, but our work around racial equity and re-examining our practices started well before that. And like a lot of private foundations, frankly, for us, rooted in whiteness, rooted in extractive wealth. And we now have to look at how do we take that wealth and how do we deploy it in a way that dismantles inequity, and with our specific focus on the arts. We've also, I think, kind of picking up on the point that Tempestt made, in doing that work, we're also looking at our investments and looking at how we can go beyond supporting nonprofit 501c3 organizations and support emerging creative entrepreneurs, particularly BIPOC entrepreneurs, because a lot of the creative energy in BIPOC communities is actually not happening within the 501c3 model. So we have to reassess our practices. So this is a hard to read, but we created it actually for our board because, and I'll go into more detail, as we made the commitment to dramatically increase our funding in response to the pandemic, we began being very responsive and operating in a very different way than we've historically operated, very nimble, creating new initiatives, pivoting, and that, I will admit, has been a challenge for both board and staff to grapple and get our hands around. But I think it's been a very important shift in terms of how we operate and thinking about how much of that we keep. So the pie chart, while some of the letters are hard to read, basically breaks down what I'm going to talk about, which is our increased investment, which is a $3 million overspend. So basically we committed to doubling our grant making in response to COVID. So first, the immediate response. It became immediately evident in early March that there was a crisis brewing for the cultural sector. I should actually note today for this community happens to be the 500th day since the shutdown, since we locked down. So many people are kind of marking this day as the 500th day since kind of COVID began here, even though, of course, we know it was starting to begin well before that. So I went to the board, actually, and we had an electronic vote from the board to respond to the crisis. We had actually just moved into a new space. So we were dealing with a move, tech install, AV install, art install, all at the same time that COVID was hitting. And to our board's credit, they immediately responded approving sending out cash to every single grantee organization. No strings attached, trust-based philanthropy. We picked a number, to be honest. There wasn't a great amount of research or strategy around it because we didn't have time. So we said, let's send every grantee 10% of their most recent grant. And we literally, my board chair came into the office so we could put 2 signatures on the checks, and we literally signed the checks, sent them out, and locked the office and didn't come back for several months. That was, again, not a huge amount of money. We're not a huge foundation, but hugely impactful. I mean, we heard from many organizations that it allowed them, for example, if they were in the middle of production and they had to shut down, otherwise they wouldn't have paid their artists for the completion of the run of the show. And this immediate cash allowed them to pay the artists. It allowed them to pay their rent, to keep their space open. And it was also meaningful that we, frankly, what it meant philosophically, that we responded immediately. Then a little more strategic, we had our next board meeting in April, and that's when the board approved doubling our grant making. And that was a huge step for us. You know, most foundations tend to treat their 5% payout as both a ceiling and a floor. You know, everybody shoots for the 5%. And for us to say, no, we're going to spend 10% this year was, you know, an enormous commitment, to be honest, especially at a time when it looked like the stock market was going to tank. So we made this decision knowing that actually our assets could decline significantly. And we also made it, again, to the board's credit, without spelling out in detail how we were going to spend that money. We basically just said, the community needs us. We have to be prepared to invest to respond to this crisis. One of the immediate things we did was, interestingly, and actually different from the way things often operate, the first arts COVID relief fund was focused on individual artists that was created here in Denver. So the individual artists came first, and then we were actually looking at the community saying, that's fantastic. I should say in our focus, and this may change in the future, but right now we don't directly fund individual artists. We fund arts organizations, and we said, the artists need the organizations to survive too. So we need both. It's not either or, it's both and. And there was, and the state initiated, the governor initiated COVID relief fund, excluded the arts. So it became clear that we were going to have to take the lead in creating an arts focused COVID Arts and Culture Relief Fund, and also that we could not do it alone. And so we committed $1 million to seed an Arts and Culture Relief Fund. The other thing is, talking about listening, we'd already been on a path of really trying to listen, particularly to really small grassroots BIPOC organizations and organizations serving other historically marginalized groups. We realized that even in our focus on BIPOC groups, we weren't really getting to the really small groups. And they were really important in the community, but we had not historically funded them. So we had already done a series of listening sessions with these organizations. And we had already pre-COVID decided to create a program to immediately start funding some of them. And so we created a very simple application process, and we were going to provide 10 $5,000 grants, and recognizing many of these groups had budgets of, let's say, $30,000. So a $5,000 grant would have been their first foundation grant ever, and probably their largest single grant ever. Once COVID hit, we basically decided to fund every single organization. So there were a total of about 20 applicants, and rather than go through any kind of process, we just immediately sent them $5,000 checks and supported all these organizations, because to the point that has been made earlier, the BIPOC organizations were impacted disproportionately, and those communities impacted disproportionately by COVID. And so we wanted to be responsive to that. So then we moved on, and a few months later, we had our July board meeting. And at that point, obviously, George Floyd had happened. And as we, not to reiterate what folks have said already, obviously, racial injustice did not start with that incident, but it became a kind of a defining moment for, I think, for all of us. And then when you had more and more incidents layered on top of that, the work that we were already doing around racial justice just became all that more important. And again, as many have talked about, you know, the idea of kind of two pandemics, one of which was not going to go away, and one of which was there already pre-COVID. And so the board agreed to kind of look at that $3 million in a different way to respond to both issues. We did secure the Denver Foundation as a partner in the relief fund, which was also important because they have not historically been focused on the arts. So it was a big issue in our community to get our community foundation as a partner on this arts fund. And we began then raising funds and establishing criteria, which did prioritize BIPOC communities in the relief fund. We also began to provide additional relief funding on a case-by-case basis. So we realized we already do grant making. We didn't stop our regular grant making process. And so as every organization came up, we looked at how they were surviving or not the pandemic and where other resources were coming. Did they not get a PPP loan? Did they not get other relief funding? Were they in particular crisis? And so we made decisions on a case-by-case basis, and that meant some groups got extra money and some groups didn't. And so we had to make those choices. We also decided, because we were already committed to leadership, we wanted to make additional investments in the BIPOC fellows within our Livingston Fellowship Program. There were 23 of these leaders, and we committed to providing $10,000 grants to each of them to, in effect, double down on their leadership, to reinvest in their leadership, which we had already invested in. And I would say with that investment, some of them were not currently leading organizations. They may have left the organization they were with when they started in that program, but we decided, you know what, again, we will give them money to direct to organizations within the community that they feel are doing important work and need to be supported. So we empowered them to direct those funds, even if they were not leading an organization and we were not funding their organization. That was a total investment of an additional $230,000. We then committed to 2 initiatives, and I'll talk a little bit more about these because we haven't actually launched them yet. So we committed to 2 initiatives, Imagining a Just Denver, that was a little bit of a friendly theft from an initiative that had been launched in Oakland, that was going to fund 5 individual artists to create artworks that imagine justice in Denver. How would you imagine a just Denver? And then to do deep investments in 2 different BIPOC neighborhoods that were weaving the arts into how to preserve the culture of their neighborhood in the face of gentrification and displacement. And then we also had already created with some other funders a program called Arts and Society that funded the connection between art and social justice, art and healthcare, art and homelessness, all of these issues that was enormously impactful. We had just done a round of grants in April. We were able to get all the other collaborating funders in that initiative to respond to accelerate the next round. So rather than waiting a year, all the funders put in extra money immediately, and we did another round of Arts and Society grant making that fall of 2020. That was an extra $500,000 into the community. In many cases, to fund artists and arts organizations, specifically utilizing the arts to respond to COVID. And then next, kind of where the relief fund went, we were really gratified that we were able to raise another $1 million on top of our $1 million. To be honest, we're a foundation. We don't have a development department. We don't raise money. So for us, it was a big leap to go out and solicit funding from other funders. And that gave us a total of $2 million that we were able to distribute. We made 96 grants, 2 rounds, 72 groups. Some groups got funded in both rounds. Heavy priority on BIPOC organizations. For us, it was also great because many of those groups were not groups that we were already funding. So it helped introduce us to new organizations that we hadn't funded in the past. For that program, to get to the issue I talked about earlier, we decided the geography had to be Metro Denver. It had to encompass the 7 counties, not just Denver. And also one of our Livingston Fellows, Jamie Duffy, who some folks may know, runs a great organization called Youth on Record, wrote a very public letter calling on funders to reduce red tape, to respond to COVID. You know, organizations were understaffed, stressed, and yet funders were asking for the same red tape, the same documentation, the same letters, the same final reports. And we had already, frankly, streamlined our process. We prioritized multi-year general operating support, but we took her call to action to heart and we reduced our red tape even further. We eliminated or minimized application requirements for groups that we already knew. Just come into us and we'll fund you again. Minimized or eliminated final reporting requirements. And then just this past May, we made another round of those essentially unsolicited grants to our existing grantees. We had funds remaining from that $3 million. We decided, again, rather than making judgment calls on who needed it more than others, each of our grantees got 40% of their most recent grant. 73 orgs received a total of $600,000. And that was enormously beneficial to the community. So what's next? We have a little bit of that $3 million still remaining. As I mentioned, the Imagining a Just Denver and BIPOC neighborhood grant funding have still not coalesced into implemented programs. We've kind of lumped those funds together into a pool. So coming up in the next year, we're going to be figuring out what the community needs now, how best to deploy those resources, both towards remaining COVID response, but also towards racial justice. We have been working for the last year with the Gemini Group on a comprehensive assessment of anti-racism within our foundation, within all our systems, all our programs. That's led to the creation of a racial equity strategic plan. That is going to be the grounding of a new strategic plan for the foundation. So many of these changes that we've made in response to COVID, and this gets to my closing points, will be deeply discussed as part of that process. And in the next few months, what of those things should remain as our practices? For example, the tension between trust-based philanthropy and wanting to gather data around racial equity among our grantees. Status, some of the work, for example, that New York did recently and LA did recently around inequity in staff compensation for BIPOC staff versus white staff. Well, you can't get that information unless you gather it. And does that go against trust-based philanthropy? So striking that balance and saying, yes, we need data, but we also need to fund the organizations we believe in. And then the big question, should we be overspending? And again, this is something that has been a big part of the conversations around decolonizing philanthropy, looking at our assets, looking at impact investing, but also looking at overspending. Why do we continue to hold on to all this money? And are the needs so great now that we need to be investing more? And so we're going to be going through a deep conversation around, should this overspending continue? And if it means we go away in 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, so be it. If we don't make these investments now, is the community going to really be in the kind of shape we want it to be in 20, 30, 40 years from now? And do we just trust more wealth will be created and other funders will replace us if we go away? But that's a big conversation, and that's a conversation we're going to be having in the next few months. So with that, I will turn it back to Cheryl Lynn.
All right. Thank you so much, Gary. And thank you all for your very strong presentations. We've already started to receive some questions in the Q&A, so I'll direct them in a moment. But for everyone else, if you have anything on your mind, please do share your questions in the Q&A at the bottom of your screen and be specific about who the question is for. All right. I'm not sure if you can hear my nieces in the background, but apologies if you can hear all of that. Okay. Whoa. All right. So first question I'll direct to you, Gary, because I guess both of the questions sort of start with your presentation and then kind of veer out. So how are you defining BIPOC org? By, for, and about? That comes from our audience.
Sure. No, I think that's a great question. And that's a question that we're all asking. And we've had lots of conversations around that. We have generally been looking at BIPOC-led and serving. So looking at both those criteria. But one of the things on the table for this deeper conversation that we're going to be going through is, how do we get more nuanced in how we look at that? For example, I remember, many years ago, I was a program director at the New York State Council on the Arts, and it was during the era, and even after that, when Sharon Luckman was the executive director of Alvin Ailey. So here you have, our preeminent black dance company in the country with a white executive director. Does that make it not a BIPOC organization because they happen to have a white executive director at that point? So, you know, these things are nuanced and complicated, and you have to look at them, I think, on a case-by-case basis. But I think the big issue is just making sure that you're not investing in organizations, which has historically happened, and we've seen this too, equity efforts at white-led and serving organizations, and not prioritizing supporting the organizations that are in the community, led by people from the community.
Thank you for that, Gary. The next two questions actually stay with Gary and Tempestt. So I'm going to start asking, the next one is really long. So I'll start, we'll take a break, you can respond, and then we'll go back. So someone else asks, curious to know more about the leadership initiatives that Gary and Tempestt are describing. How did you design your programs to invest in BIPOC leadership? And they go on to say that one of the issues they're facing is because of systemic inequity, a lack of organizational structures that have been founded are now led by BIPOC artists. Investing in leadership often means investing in BIPOC artists, or leaders of white founded organizations. You kind of alluded to that just now, that are now engaging in diversity. How do you support new models and initiatives that are BIPOC led? So that can actually go to both you, Gary, and Tempestt.
Well, since I just talked, Tempestt, do you want to jump in and answer that first, and then I'll follow up?
Sure. It's a great question. So, you know, our leadership investment program is a really interesting one. It has a fellowship component to it to try and understand the pathways into philanthropy. But then there's our Leaders for a New Chicago Award, which I think are kind of like the key way to understand how field thinks about leadership investment. And it's a self-nominated or nomination-based process where organizations that have been funded by field and its partners in that work, like MacArthur Foundation, for instance, are they're selected and given, the ones who are selected from the nomination pool are given an award that's an equal award to them as individuals and then also to their organizations, just knowing that folks who are working within community, when they get support of, if they're $50,000 grants, 25 to the individual, 25 to the organization. And it just is known of those communities that those folks are going to take that money and give it back to their organization. So trying to figure out a way to counter that by giving general operating funds to the organization simultaneously is like a direct way to not only continue supporting the organizations that field is already supporting, but to make sure that these individuals who are doing extremely difficult work on a daily basis and committing so much of themselves to their communities are also taking care of themselves in various ways. So when it comes to leadership too, I think, you know, to the first question, how we define BIPOC, it is the by, about, and for, but it also is statistical. We are looking for organizations that are 51% or more within their staff, board, and decision-making positions, folks of color. And then I think it's also within the conversations that we have within the relationships that we're building, because within nonprofits, like a lot of what happens is a matter of, it's power dynamics. So you're understanding how power works within the organization, who's making decisions, who can have input, who's at certain tables, and how those things happen. So as program officers, we're often listening for that and looking for that in our conversations with those organizations. So I hope that begins to answer the question. And I think to Gary's point about, you know, white-led organizations, it is complex, but I think, again, it's about power dynamics. Like, it's not to say, like, to me, it's a question of, do we really want to believe that we live in an arts ecosystem that doesn't have people who represent those communities who could be at the helm of those organizations? Why are organizations that are serving communities of color led by a white staff? You know, like, those are questions that need to be asked. And so for us, when it comes to like the percentage of the board, staff, and leadership, those are instances where it can kind of get murky, but then it comes out in conversation. We can't just rely on the statistics to make those decisions, because we know that it's a very complex situation.
Absolutely.
Should I jump in, Sherilyn?
If you'd like, you can. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. So just quickly, our leadership program is called the Livingston Fellowship Program. It's been around for 17 years. There's a lot of information on our website about it. I would say the thing that's kind of its kind of core focus area and what's unique about it is that it's not curriculum based. It is totally customized for each individual leader. They get now a $35,000 grant and guidance from us in shaping that into, in effect, a personal leadership growth plan. So they can invest in training, they can invest in traveling to Africa to meet an extraordinary leader who they've always wanted to meet. They can invest in self-care, work-life balance issues. It's pretty unique. Then I will say, when I came into the foundation, the program had been around for 10 years, and statistically, 20% of the fellows had been BIPOC. So a relatively small percentage of the fellowship pool, mostly leading large organizations, large enterprises. We have shifted that enormously. So in recent classes, it's been 70, 80% of the fellows have been BIPOC. And part of that has been really focusing on smaller organizations and BIPOC-led and serving organizations, and shifting what we're looking for in leadership. And I will say part of it, and recently, that has led to the fellows themselves pushing us to do more, to be more, to really look at the fact that being anti-racist should be a core quality and value in being a leader of a nonprofit organization today, whether you're a white leader or a BIPOC leader. And so this is something that we're in the process of reassessing and weaving into the very fabric of the program, and having cohort conversations among our BIPOC leaders and our white leaders, because there are things that they want to talk about that particularly the BIPOC leaders don't feel they can comfortably talk about with the white leaders present. And so we've had to recognize that there are conversations that need to be had within spaces with the BIPOC leaders. And so, and to be honest, we also realized the program had grown to the point where it needed dedicated staff leadership. And so we also hired a new senior staff person to run that program and really think about, how do we advance leadership, and how should the program grow and change? You know, do we need to be investing to address inequity? Do we need to be investing in emerging leaders as well? Because the reality is that there are not enough paths to leadership for BIPOC leaders. And so do we have to, in effect, go lower down within organizations and catch people earlier in their career to help prepare them for leadership? So these are all questions that we're now asking ourselves that will be part of that larger strategic planning process that we're in the midst of.
Great, thank you both. This question kind of comes up in similar ways. So I'm gonna kind of shoot this out to both of you, Tempestt and Gary, and if anyone else wants to chime in, that's great. So someone says, I'd be interested to hear them discussing support for artist initiatives that are not incorporated as nonprofits and would not be seen as individual artist work either. And someone else mentions organizations that are outside of the 501c3 structure, or limitations that in dealing with the IRS. So if you could speak to how you've handled that, that'd be great.
So for Field, that's a great question, and one that we're constantly working through. I think if you go to Field's website and specifically look at the media and storytelling program area, there's a lot of, because media, it tends to be a for-profit area. So that was something that had to immediately be addressed when establishing that program area. It kind of goes through some of the ins and outs of how grant seekers have to navigate that if they are for profit. So you can see some of that there. Within the arts portfolio, a lot of it is through fiscal sponsorships and relationships with nonprofits, but understanding that those relationships between those organizations and those nonprofits, really understanding what the details and the, again, power dynamics of those relationships are, and how much decision making those cooperatives or those for-profit businesses or those artist-run collaboratives have in how they use the money. That becomes a really important part of the conversation and how we make decisions. So hopefully that offers like a little bit of help around that. But yeah. I think, you know, what's been really interesting over the past year, I think, is the way that I've been having a lot of conversations with other folks at foundations that have been going back to their legal counsel and asking new questions. And I think that that's really key to your own circumstances, what is allowed even in your state, or, you know, like there are things that I think have been baked into philanthropy that we think are required and aren't necessarily required. And I think we can lean into the fact that we are within a creative sector, so let's get creative and let's ask more questions and rethink how we're doing this.
Thank you, Tempestt. Gary.
Sure. I mean, I alluded to this a little bit already. So we've actually changed investment firms to a firm that is focused on impact investing, and this is very much something that we are looking at, both from, you know, all the different lenses. So managers of color, making sure that we're putting some of our funds with firms that are led by, owned by investment managers of color, and also looking at where the money is going and looking at more PRIs, more direct investments in creative enterprises in the community that might not be coming from a nonprofit arts organization. An example of this is we just gave a $500,000 PRI to a local CDFI to specifically direct loan funds to local, creative businesses with a special emphasis on BIPOC and women-owned businesses. So, you know, that's something that we're definitely looking at. And to Tempest's point, also looking at what can we legally do, not do, and reassessing perhaps some of the assumptions of what we can do and not do.
Absolutely. Well, thank you both. Thank you, everyone. Tempestt, you had one more thought?
Yes, and only because I think that this is a really important question to address. And someone brought up supporting disability communities and immigrant communities beyond kind of like the racial implications. I think that is a very important conversation to have. We haven't figured that out with Field, but I do know when it comes to, you know, when we talk about disability and immigrant populations in Chicago, those are by and large BIPOC communities. So there's a lot of disability within, I know, Black communities and, you know, just within communities of color by and large. So in a lot of ways, that is something that shows up in our grant making that we are very intentional about. But when it comes to the racial lines and understanding, I think some of what Dr. Basset mentioned about some of how COVID is impacting white populations of New York, like it's a complex conversation that we need to continue to dig into. So I just wanted to make sure that that was addressed because I think that is a very, very important question.
Of course, of course. Thank you, Tempestt. I appreciate you doing that. And also, in the spirit of keeping the conversation going, we did provide the contact information of all of the presenters. So please do reach out to them and continue asking your questions so that we can keep the conversation going. And to those who are inquiring, yes, we will be sending a recording of the presentation and the slides to you in follow-up to this webinar. And so we're glad you came. We thank our presenters one more time for coming and presenting and sharing so much information. If you have any questions, you can feel free to reach out to me. And please do take the survey and follow up so we know what you thought. And thank you so much for joining us. Have a great day.